Hi, and welcome to the Lumida Legacy Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Gilder. On this podcast, we'll explore how to achieve and plan for a long, healthy life, as well as how to prepare for the inevitable and unforeseen through estate planning, insurance, and end-of-life decisions. We'll talk candidly with experts who advise high and ultra-high net worth clients so you can learn how to apply their strategies and tactics to your own longevity and legacy planning. Hey, Mollie, thanks so much for joining me here today. Really excited to be able to talk with you. You are an incredible expert on sleep. I love your podcast. I love your newsletter, and your website has tons of resources. Sleep is a skill. It truly is a skill. I know that I taught my children that when we sleep train them, and I first learned of the framework that it is indeed a skill. I didn't really think about it as an adult skill until I
Yeah.
realized I was getting really bad sleep a few years ago, and it became more important in my life. And so I'm really excited to learn and talk with you today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became such an expert on sleep?
Well, one, I love that you sharing the route that you've taken to develop this interest in sleep. And I hear this a lot where, and this was part of my story really, where I didn't think about sleep that much in my formative years. And it wasn't until it became a problem for me that I actually honed in on it. Now, for the listener, hopefully, wherever they might find themselves, we can provide some practical takeaways so that they maybe don't have to go through the rock bottom that I'll share about my story. But certainly, I love what you're pointing to is like the realization, kind of the blind spot that many of us might uncover for ourselves of, oh, wow, I didn't even realize I wasn't sleeping particularly well. I thought this was just how people slept because we don't really have much to compare it to. We just have our own experience. And so many people just don't realize that there's a whole other world available to them of optimizing their sleep. So that's something I'm really excited about. But your question around how in the world did I get so immersed in this field of sleep? And it is a really important question because it was not in the plans. So, what things look like and how my life is really how I think of it now is really in a three-part series around sleep, with sleep at its sort of core, and which is wild. And so the what that breaks down to is kind of before I went through this sleep breakdown, during and after. And the before was littered with a lot of just labels and narratives with my sleep, and I really didn't, consider my sleep too much. Kind of similar to what you were sharing. I simply thought that, like, many things, it was just sort of the cards I was dealt. And I would say things like a lot of labels and narratives of I'm a short sleeper, I'm a night owl, it's in my genes, I'll sleep when I'm dead. If I didn't sleep enough, it would just be like, oh, well, come on, mind over matter, pull yourself by your bootstraps type sentiments, And it was just something to survive. And it wasn't something to really look too much at because of all the things, why that? And I wasn't connecting as the years went on and my habits became more pronounced as far as my justification and rationalization as a serial entrepreneur in Manhattan, burning the candle at both ends and starting and going to bed later and later. And this has always been trending this way since I was a kid to teenage years, college, and just how I did things with sleep, late leaning. And so I didn't correlate these kind of spidering into other aspects of my health and well being and these deleterious effects with my health. So that looked like the beginnings of an ulcer, shingles in my 20s, mounting anxiety for the women listening, issues with my period, chronic headaches, migraines, a series of things that were pointing to something that I was doing with my health was not working, but sleep was not really part of what I was mindfully looking at. And so from that place, it wasn't until I went through this rock bottom period of insomnia that completely changed my life. I was traveling internationally. I grew up with not a lot of money, had never really traveled much. So adding jet lag and crossing multiple time zones on top of my poor habits, on top of lots of stress with my business, that was finally just what kind of shook out was this period of insomnia. What's insomnia? Difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, early morning awakenings. And what I ended up experiencing during that period of time was then this development of what is often referred to as sleep anxiety, where I started having these times where the sun would start setting and my heart starts racing, and I start future tripping about the night ahead, fearing I can't go through another night without sleep. I feel like I'm losing my mind, and really dark thoughts around, like, I don't know if this is life now, if this is like if I'm stuck like this or something. I don't know if I could keep going on in this direction. And so those were some of the things that would be rattling around in my head during that period of time. I finally went to the doctors in Croatia, of all things, and leave with sleeping pills. And so, for anyone listening, if you are struggling with your sleep, please know that that's not supposed to be the first line treatment, especially certainly in the United States. It is defined that you would leave with or should leave with recommendations around at least starting with CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Fortunately, that doesn't always go like that. Even in the United States, we are often met with suggestions of, take some melatonin. Oh, how about some sleeping pills, et cetera, antidepressants, other things. So I leave with these medications, and now I'm super conflicted. And I remember the moment of holding that prescription and feeling so desperate and knowing like I'm still going to take these things, but now I feel guilt ridden and even more confused around, well, what next? I mean, what's the plan here? Am I just going to keep taking these things? Is this now a life of dependency? What is going on here? And so what came out of that was there's enough of a problem that finally I realized, okay, if I'm going to solve this problem, it feels as if I'm going to need to figure this out on my own, kind of go down the rabbit hole and figure out what does it even take to get great sleep, not just for philosophical musings, but because again, I feel like I'm really losing it and at my wit's end. So I go down the rabbit hole, and during that period, I spend a lot of time, energy, effort, money, and throughout that process, I do a lot of things that don't work, and so there's that. I do a lot of things that kind of, and then some things that really move the needle. And I'll certainly be sharing or intend to share some of those things today. Um, and what came out on the other side was completely life changing. So now, not only, throughout that process, was I able to restore that homeostasis of my sleep, which I shared wasn't even that great from before. So, not only just sleeping for sleep's sake, but then getting to this whole other conversation that I didn't even think was available to me of optimizing my sleep, actually sleeping markedly well and measurably well consistently, and that as exemplified on many wearables, both consumer grade, but then also information in lab, etc. So if that's the case, then I could not stop talking about it now as this new reality starts opening itself up to me. And I start sharing about this with other people that have been struggling with their sleep. And then organically, these small groups start emerging. And then over time, then what gets created is now sleep is a skill, which I am committed as a beginning place for us to stand in our modern society. That sleep has become the skill set. And so with that on the other side, today, now I now get to experience sleeping quantifiably well, as I pointed to, but also getting to work with, now we've worked with thousands of individuals in different capacities on supporting their sleep. We have a weekly newsletter that's been going out every Monday for over 6 or almost at 6 years, called Sleep Obsession. So we've got a whole community of people there that are looking to improve and up-level their sleep results. We've got the #2 sleep podcast. So we've had, hundreds of people coming on the podcast to point to different ways and different angles in and improving your sleep beyond just like, oh, use some lavender or whatever we might read in the top 10 tips to improve your sleep. And then I have developed a particular niche in high stakes poker. So I work with a lot of high stakes poker players in particular. And I share that mainly because they serve as a great example for us. And I think we can speak more to it in this conversation of what a perfect demonstration of circadian dysregulation can look like, because why they're in literal environments, casinos designed on purpose to confuse the circadian rhythm. So there's an absence of windows, any sense of sunrise, sunset, no clocks, lots of stimuli, lots of faux lights, lots of dopamine hits available. And I make this argument today that many of us are closer than we might realize to that sort of environment than maybe our ancestors were. So we can delve into that. But I say all that because for anyone listening, no matter where you might be at with your sleep and the spectrum of, really, really struggling or, maybe doing fine, and just, maybe curious to tune in to hear, is there something new that maybe I'm missing? Wherever you might be at on that spectrum of sleep right now, I'm clear that there are things we can do to up level your results and kind of tap into some often unexpected benefits by taking on this area of life mindfully.
So let's start at the beginning. Why do we sleep? I
Yeah.
spend a lot of time sleeping, maybe not as much as I should. We'll find out later in the conversation.
Sure.
I spend more time today sleeping than I used to. I used to also say the same exact things. I'll sleep when I die.
Yeah.
Something I repeatedly stated, especially to my kids when they were little.
Oh.
But I've fixed that. I've changed the way I communicate about sleep. And then I often would say when I was tired, oh, mind over matter. If you
Yeah.
don't mind, it doesn't matter. And so I had the same exact narratives going on, and
Yeah.
same story. Finally, insomnia put me into a place where I cared about it.
Yeah.
But at bottom, it still is interesting to think about, like, why do we sleep? We spend
Totally.
something like, the stats better than I do, a quarter, a third, something like
Yes.
that of our life sleeping.
Right. That's a great place to begin. So the why and how much of our life is this taking up? Is it really worth like having a whole podcast episode about? And I would, granted, I'm biased, but absolutely. How about an entire podcast devoted just to this topic? And so one, yes, we sleep a third of our lives. On average, 26 years are spent asleep. So it sort of behooves us to take a look at it. And for those of us who are really looking to take on, big things, we've got maybe our New Year's resolutions at the start of every year, or goals that we're looking to hit. We'll consider that about 4 months out of that year, you're going to be asleep. So we might want to take a look at, are we doing this thing well? Is this serving us? Or, maybe if you want to be contrarian about it, do we need to be doing this? Yeah, let's just like look at the dialogue about it, because we're spending a significant, or maybe there's an opportunity to be spending a significant amount of time on it, and making sure that we're finding that Goldilocks or sweet spot of, if we're talking about sleep duration, as you kind of pointed to, how much time is devoted to our sleep. Are we devoting enough time? Maybe there's some red flags that maybe we're oversleeping. Like, there's a lot there. So first, the why we sleep question. There's probably one of the books that has gotten the most press in recent years in the sleep field has been the book literally named Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. So if people want to delve in and really explore this from many facets and angles, that might be something that you might want to really go to town on. And so taking the kind of short side of it, why do we sleep? Like, is it something, it's funny. I'm about to be doing a post about how we're just coming up, and it's just about exactly about about 100 years ago to this day, that a Columbia professor had pointed to this, and this had gotten some press around, we no longer need to sleep announcement. We've surpassed, this is like some old primal thing that we keep doing out of, just routine. And we could actually, it might serve us to, this was the old quote 100 years ago, that we could start shaving off around 5 minutes every night until in many years, then you're not even needing to sleep. This was part of the recommendation about 100 years ago, out of a, Ivy League institution. So there's been a lot of different theories on the need for sleep. Is it the importance of it, different thoughts over the years. Where are we at today? Well, today we have plenty of studies to support the fact that that was a wrong statement, an incorrect statement. We have not evolved out of the need for sleep. And so making sure we understand that this is absolutely crucial. Some ways to exemplify this, if you go to PubMed and put in sleep and just about anything, any domain that's important to you, cardiovascular health, cognitive health, aging, longevity, pain management, the list just keeps on going. You can find research to support sleep's ability to play a role in some of these really crucial aspects of life. We actually struggle to find a domain of life that is not impacted when we're not getting sufficient sleep. But then on the flip side, on the positive spin of it, when we start really improving our sleep, then seeing, kind of often measurable changes in a positive means in those same domains. So one, I would say in recent years, something that might be noteworthy as to why we sleep is in 2012, the discovery of glymphatic drainage with a G was kind of uncovered. And glymphatic drainage with a G versus an L, like lymphatic drainage when you get the massages and stuff. Glymphatic drainage with a G is a bit different. And this is something around this cleansing process that's happening in the brain that appears to be happening largely within sleep, particularly on the first half of the night. And what appears to have correlations in some of our concerns. If you're not getting enough of that cleansing process, that glymphatic drainage, then what seems to show up is, could there be correlations with neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia? And previously, we might have thought, well, these things, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do preemptively to stave off our risks of these. Well, if what we're uncovering with sleep is accurate, then this is something you can be actually preemptively doing every single night, is prioritizing this area of life so that you're getting that sufficient brain cleansing. Because what we find, if you're not leaving enough of that sleep opportunity and getting sufficient quality of sleep, then what seems to be uncovered is there's not enough of that cleansing, and this glymphatic drainage process isn't occurring as well. And then amyloid beta plaques seem to kind of mount and build in the brain. And this hardening process is concerning and kind of problematic. So we want to prioritize that. So that's just one aspect of health. We're not even getting into your cardiovascular health. We see this come up a lot for people, say, for instance, easily exemplified with sleep apnea. So many people are running around undiagnosed with sleep apnea. Certain estimates are anywhere from 80% to 90% of people out in the population right now have undiagnosed sleep apnea in different estimates. I mean, those are huge numbers.
Wow.
So I would like to see, quick a tangent, I would like to see a future where we are all tested, not just once, but multiple times throughout our lives, at least 2 or more times, to make sure that we are not stepping over sleep disorders like sleep apnea that is so prevalent. And we're seeing it kind of mount in instances. And there's a lot of questions on why. Is it because, it does go hand in hand. This is not the only thing, but as we gain weight, that can go up as our hormones shift, as the musculature in our tongues kind of start to atrophy for some people, or not quite atrophy, but lose that tenseness or that ability to stay in its right place. Instead, it's falling slack while you're sleeping and going, kind of cutting into your airway. The difficulty with nasal breathing, all of these things. There's a lot of theories on, like, well, why are we kind of falling apart in these areas? Lots of theories, but regardless, we are seeing these instances certainly go up and be missed. So that's a quick tangent. But what I would say is, on your initial question of why do we sleep? Well, at its core, and when we wake up, our goal is to feel rejuvenated, to feel rested the next day. And unfortunately, when a lot of us wake up, and all of us are going to have times we wake up and we're like, ugh, that wasn't the best night of sleep. And, maybe we're not feeling quite our best. But if we, so that can happen, of course, but if we are consistently waking up feeling truly fatigued and struggling and needing to compensate with lots of stimulants, naps, all kinds of things to try to get through the day, some of these can be red flags that something about our sleep is not serving us, because at its core, sleep can fuel our wake cycle, our ability to take on our day with gusto. And if something's broken on the sleep component, that's going to show up unequivocally in your kind of wake cycle.
So let's talk there. You said wake cycle. Let's dive in a little bit to understand sleep cycle. So we talked about why we sleep, but
Yeah,
what is sleep during the night, right? Like
sure.
a lot of things happen, and you're tracking with wearable devices. I know we'll talk about that and talk about the data, but it shows me that there's different components of my sleep cycle. So now I have a little bit better understanding of why we sleep, but what happens through the night? What is that sleep cycle that that leads to rejuvenation, right? Like what is the actual optimal sleep cycle, and
Sure.
timing wise too?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and when I say wake cycle, what I'm pointing to is simply the fact that as human beings, as diurnal creatures, we're meant to be active by day, awake and active by day, and at rest, asleep by night. And so, those are the two dualities of human beings. There's other creatures that are nocturnal and they have a whole upside down thing to us. For us, that is what we've discovered, what we know to be true about human beings, this diurnal component. And when we deviate much from that, we start to see things go up in instances of kind of deleterious effects to our health. We know that about shift workers, and this is important for us to study because they are crucial, of course, and we're grateful for them for our society. And when you land in the hospital at 3 a.m, like, you want your shift workers to be available and hopefully to be supporting them as best as we can, to bring in the latest in kind of sleep and circadian science, so that the kind of deviating from some of those normal rhythms of nature, being awake with the sun and then winding down and sleeping as the sun has set. When we deviate from that, there can be things that show up measurably: cancer rates, obesity, diabetes, psychiatric disorders, reproductive disorders, sleep wake, etc. So there's some real cause and effect. And that goes into your question about sleep and what does that look like. So one, we want to think about the timing of our sleep. And so is the timing of it hopefully a bit aligned with these rhythms of nature and being informed and supported by these rhythms of nature? And this gets into the weeds on the massive importance of light dark in our results and strength of our circadian rhythm and the quality of our sleep. We know that that's the number one Zeitgeber or time giver for the quality, or for the strength of that circadian rhythm. So
So
we,
when you say timing, Molly, do
yeah.
you mean when you go to sleep and when you wake up, or how long you sleep, or both?
Both, exactly. So, and this is where the puzzle pieces of sleep come into play. That there are some of these nuances in thinking more critically about sleep, this kind of vital sign to our health, and yet sometimes it just gets reduced to no more than just, well, how I get 8 hours, so I must be fine. Whereas there's a lot more to it. But that's not to belittle the fact that duration is a component, timing is a component. So both of those are key and at play. So how consistent are you? Particularly, we like to hone in on the wake up time to begin for people listening too. So really taking a look at what time are you waking up each day, and is it the same 7 days a week across the board? Because often we might see people say, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," and they think of the rounding up of the fact that, well, about 4 or 5 days out of the week, yeah, I'm waking up at around the same time. But then the weekends come, or then the off time comes, or whatever, and then we're sleeping in, compensating, and that can feel like a wise move, that can feel like, well, I had a rough week or whatever, so I'm going to catch up on that sleep, et cetera, et cetera. But we have research, especially even just recently, some additional and new research to point to the importance of sleep consistency. And sleep loves consistency. A lot of the things that we're going to be unpacking today are largely free or low cost in nature, but do require some of these behavioral, environmental, kind of psychological shifts. And that's where, things can get a little more dicey as the actual practical application of this. So when we're looking at then throughout the course of the night, we're looking at that timing, we're looking at that duration, we're also looking at sleep fragmentation. So something kind of interesting and new that's being worked on right now is, likely many people in, say, the longevity space, kind of biohacking space, what have you, might be cued into this ability to test for your biological versus chronological age. And many people will, do this and kind of gamify this and keep aiming to like reverse their age and all these fun things. Well, you can also, we're beginning to have what's being put together of the ability in the future to test for your sleep age, which is pretty interesting. So what would that look like? So that would look like we would see, all right, so, a person's 43 and then they're 43 years old, but then they're sleeping like a 62-year-old or what have you, right? For example. And then what would we understand the difference of those ages? Well, one of the characteristics seems to particularly be exemplified by fragmentation. How much are you waking up throughout the course of the night? And that's something that we often tend to see uptick as we age. So if you are sleeping in an older way, exhibiting and exemplified as in alignment with a older way of sleeping, we want to cue into that, because that is something that we can on the ground start to unpack of what's going on there. So in the case of fragmentation, this is probably one of the more common reasons people come my way, is they're so frustrated by their wake ups. They are waking up at 3 a.m, 4 a.m. They're so over it. And so we want to uncover the why for that. And there are many reasons. If you want to get into wake up reasons, we certainly can. And there's a lot. And so that fragmentation aspect, but then you can also get into the quality of that sleep. So if we are testing with, sleep stage, looking at the sleep stage classifications, we can understand how much deep sleep, how much REM we're getting. But I will say lots of caveats with that is one of the least accurate pieces of the wearables that we have today on our hand and wrist. So, a lot of people I see make a lot of decisions and get pretty stressed out about some of those numbers. And I would encourage people not to do too much of that, because we do know that because it's being measured from the hand and the wrist as opposed to the head, which is where we do understand a lot of that breakdown of what sleep stage are you in, because a lot of it's being cued in by that brain based, so our brain waves and brain state and what is being exhibited there. So if you don't have access to that information, just know that it's kind of this, whatever wearable you're using, it's their best guess based on some of what else they can deduce that you're doing throughout that, to say, oh, it's probably deep, it's probably REM. So of all the metrics, I would pay the least attention to that right now anyway. And that may change in the future. And people are working hard on trying to change that. But I would instead start to look at some of the elements of the almost boring but more sound results, as far as things like, are you asleep or are you awake? Most of the trackers are pretty good at discerning that piece, and then looking at the number of fragmentations throughout the course of the night. Additionally, things like your nervous system. So looking at things like your heart rate, your HRV, your respiratory rate, your blood oxygen, your body temperature. Especially for women, you can get a sense of how if you're menstruating age, how your cycles, your infradian rhythm are playing into your sleep results. So there is a lot of wealth of information that we can unpack with our wearables and the breadth of information that comes out with these wearables today that can make for a lot of support for both shifting some of your behaviors that might be right away impacting your sleep results, but then also serving as red flags if the type of sleep you're exhibiting might be warranting of testing further to get a either in at home sleep test. Now you can get these now in the United States for like as low as $160 to you, and just sent to you and quickly test like that night.
What are
And
you testing for with that?
so with the at-home ones, do know that some of the current at-home tests are more testing of how are you breathing throughout the course of the night. So most of them are not going to be supportive with understanding the many other sleep disorders that are out there. So in different reports, so some groups will say over 80 sleep wake disorders, depending on how they categorize these. Mount Sinai puts it at over 100 sleep wake disorders. So however you cut it, there's a lot of sleep wake disorders. But the at-home tester quite astute at understanding how are you breathing throughout the course of the night. And so are you exhibiting sort of signs of things like sleep apnea, maybe cueing into things like upper airway resistance syndrome, because it's really testing how are you breathing and heart rate, kind of heart behavior throughout the course of the night. And so, but those can be diagnostic in nature. Now we do have some new at-home tests that are exciting. And those can have like stickers all over your limbs, so we can get more information about, say, things like periodic limb movement disorder, restless leg, etc. And so these are kind of new and breaking some of the molds for some of the at-home tests. So stay tuned for some of those as we're kind of rolling out more access to those. And then in lab has been for a long time the gold standard to get much more in-depth information, but some people don't want to do it because it's like all the electrodes and all the things, and just the process of getting in there can take some time. So what can be great is the multi-step process. So you might test at home, see kind of what's going on just fundamentally there, and then if we believe it warrants more testing, then get you in lab as well.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about the wearables and deep sleep and REM, and that was where I wanted to go a little bit because I have some data that I wanted to share. I was intrigued to know how the wearables actually know you're in these stages, but it sounds like you're saying they don't necessarily know. They're making their best estimate based on lots of data. So it's not a total guess, but it's not as clear as it is in other testing circumstances. Fair?
Fair. Yeah. So I would say that so the Aura Ring, that's the one that we work with. Every person we work with is wearing the Aura Ring. So we've got a large database of Aura Ring users. So lots of information there. And you can glean a ton of information, and it can be great from a trends-based perspective, especially since when we're talking about Aura, and I'm just talking about that one for a second. I know not everyone has that, but I shared that one in particular because they are one of the rare wearables that does have 1,500 nights against a sleep lab. So they can, and so because of the level of accuracy, they're ranking about 79% accurate for their guess on are you in deep sleep or are you in REM. Now that can land as sounding like, oh, that's really low. But you want to also be aware that in a sleep lab, which is the gold standard, there's still questions of, there's disagreement as far as what state you might be in, but depending on who's looking at your sleep. So often the accuracy shakes out to around mid 80s for accuracy, even in a sleep lab. So knowing that that's where we're coming from, and then if Oura Ring is scoring at about 79% accuracy as compared to mid 80s in a sleep lab, it's actually pretty good. And that's kind of the thinking why they can almost legally say it's like having a sleep lab on your finger. So that's one example. Now, Whoop, Garmin, some of these other wearables and BioStrap and more that are out there and also giving us great information about our sleep. They're still doing some of that best guess based on what we tend to know about what how do you behave when you're in deep sleep versus REM versus light? And so then when it sees some of those characteristics, then it can kind of group you in deep or REM. But I still would have people caution about making too many decisions based on those metrics.
So here are my sleep metrics. I'm sharing the screen right now. You
Yeah.
can see the month, which was very similar to year to date in percentages. And the week, although I'm only showing it's actually a few days, it's very similar to last week.
Yeah.
Where my curiosities peaked when I saw massive changes in my average REM sleep. And I could share you some data. I actually have like random days in the last 2 weeks where I have less than an hour of REM, 47 minutes, 27 minutes, different things like that. And then I have these nights where I have like 2 hours and 30 minutes of REM, 2 hours and 40 minutes, 2 hours and 20 minutes. And so I see a big difference between like the last week or so and my month. But again, I don't know. Like, do I need more REM sleep? Is more REM sleep better? My deep sleep is down. Is that a problem? Or, hey, I'm sleeping both, almost 7 hours. I don't know what that wake time is, honestly. I do not wake up in the middle of the night.
Okay.
To my knowledge, I never get up and get out of bed or do anything like that. I hit the pillow and I wake up at my alarm at 5 a.m. pretty much 99% of the nights. I was not there a few years ago. So, we'll talk about techniques to get there, but.
Sure. And you said that that wake up part, you're largely hitting that kind of wake up time each morning.
Well, you have unveiled a little bit of areas where I'm going to learn and improve, because I am definitely of the 5 days a week I wake up at the same time.
Sure.
And then on the weekends, I tend to not set my alarm for 5 a.m. because 5 a.m. wake up is designed to give me enough time to do a workout before anybody else in the house wakes up.
Right.
And I don't need to do that on the weekend because the kids don't have to go to school. Everybody can relax. I tend not to sleep in anymore. So I'm still going to be up at sometime between like 6 and 7:30. Sometimes that's an alarm on the weekend because I want to get up and go. Sometimes that's like actually a very positive mental feeling at the end of the night when I say, I don't need an alarm for tomorrow. And I just let nature take its course. But that means Saturday and Sunday, I'm waking up at a later time. And I didn't think that was bad. I thought, oh, geez, well, I'll get extra sleep.
Right. Oh, totally. And that's one of the things we see all the time. How much extra sleep would you say on average is the weekends typically?
Well, actually, it's probably a fallacy to say extra sleep because I probably stay up later.
Right. Yes. So we're kind of just moving things out.
I'm just moving things out a bit.
Yeah. Distinction.
I'd say I tend to try to go to sleep between 10 and 11 at night. Better if it's 10, but it's harder on the weekdays because I wake up consistently at 5. And then on the weekend, if it's 11 to 12, I'll wake up sometime between like 6 and 7. So I'm still probably getting somewhere around 7 hours. Yeah. I'd say if I had to say there's more sleep on the weekend, it's probably an hour more.
Okay. Sure. And then to your point, that was a really important piece of like the bedtimes moving out as well. So we're kind of just shifting the whole sleep opportunity out a bit. Well, spending time on this just because it's one, so common, and two, really impactful for even some of these things that you're talking about like deep sleep, REM, optimizing for these. One of the places that we can all begin, and this is actually in our programs, we have 2 anchor habits that we really start with right out of the gate for just about every person. And most people still could use some fine tuning and support with both of these. And one of them is that consistent wake up time. We really want our weekends to look fairly identical to the weekdays, which can even for a lot of people be a bit of a, identity shift or kind of a lifestyle shift. Like, well, really, do I want to do that? Like, and sometimes people will actually change their wake up time if available to them so that it can be a catch all that would still inspire them to wake up on the weekends. So maybe they move from the 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. and that becomes their new consistent wake up time or what have you, just as an example. Because we're really trying to design our sleep in a way that is fully conscious and that we're at the source and helm of the design for that. And that's a big deal because what happens if we are waking up? So a reliable kind of difference that I'm often seeing is people sleeping in, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours later on the weekends. And to your point, that might include going to bed later too. But that change, and we'll see it exemplified by, you can look at your wake up time stats if you're tracking, and you'll see just lots of ticks and valleys, like peaks, valleys, peaks, valleys. And so instead, we're looking to flatline that a bit more because when we have all of that, then what is occurring? Well, then we're dealing with something known as social jet lag. And I think it needs a new name. Honestly, I think it needs to be like self-created jet lag. The reason they're calling it social jet lag is the thinking that when we don't have social constraints or like needs, so say like I got to get into work or I've got to do this or whatever, and when things change so that we can design our own sleep wake time, then we kind of go in a whole other direction. And then what occurs is like you're experiencing the symptoms of jet lag, but you didn't get on a plane, you were just home, and now you have this like drag to you. And many of us might not realize that then for the adjustment of that time zone, multiple time zones that you might have just shifted. So like I said, I'm often reliably seeing at least like 2 to 3 hours each week for many people. What happens with that? Well, it's as if they're people that are going from like New York to LA every single week, even though they didn't get on a plane. And so now that
Oh,
time,
wow.
right? And we can feel that, and we can get that analogy when any of us have done that. You just feel a little off, and
I was
yet,
just in California for a week for spring break. And so like it hits really hard because I was thinking so much while I was there about my kids' sleep and what time they were going to be adjusted to when we came home. I came home and I was like, oh my God, this jet lag. I was
yeah,
there too long. I love trips to California, but gosh, my sleep is off. Social
totally.
jet lag. I mean, maybe the terminology needs to change, but I now feel this concept
Oh,
deeply from
good.
you saying that. My
Yes.
wife may or may not be a social jet lag person. I told her I wouldn't talk about her on the podcast. So I can neither
Love
confirm nor deny whether she sleeps more on the weekend.
I love that unit, the unified kind of partnership. That's amazing. Well, we could just, ripple effect to all of us. And we can all use this reminder because it can be a tendency to be like, weekend energy or whenever you have off an opportunity, it can make sense, it can feel right to kind of just sleep in or what have you, or it can feel like the most intelligent, loving, I guess you could say, thing to do for your body. And yet, counterintuitively, a couple things are happening. So one, I'm glad that lands that kind of feeling in our bones when we are jet lagged. So this is relevant. I shared with you before we hit record that I'm about to be headed to Singapore. So I'm going to be taking the world's longest flight for almost 19 hours from New York to Singapore coming up. So I'm going to do some content on how can you time shift like a verb in advance, during, and after to mitigate and minimize as much of the jet lag effects as possible. And so there's things that we can do to support, but ideally for our regular routine life, how can we eliminate any of that sense of weirdness that comes about with jet lag? People that have felt that jet lag, it's just weird. You feel off, not properly rested. You feel not in sync with the world around you. Just as far as the light isn't lining up with what time we think it should be, and digestive system is off, when you're getting hungry is all kinds of things. We don't realize the power of our circadian clocks and the trillions of clocks in every cell and organ in our body. I've given talks to practitioners health practitioners around how I really truly believe that circadian health will be one of the next big things in wellness, including the longevity space and kind of how can we take on our health mindfully. Well, if we're not considering these clocks and all the different timelines that they're all trying to be on, our organs, different organs and different cells are on different sort of clock systems, but they're all being kept in sync by our conductor, our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is just even the geography of it is right near the eyes, which is why light dark signaling is so important. Um, but to get back to your original question around like, okay, so optimizing my sleep, I'm seeing my deep sleep numbers, I'm seeing my REM and the wake ups, I'm looking at my stats. Well, one of the best places to begin for most people is to start with that consistency. Why? Because we know that when you move around your sleep wake times, then what's getting impacted is the opportunity for some of those types of sleep that might be important to you. For instance, if you're going to bed a little bit later on those weekends, what tends to happen, because the body likes to still try to stay on time, and so it tends to cut into some of your deep sleep opportunity, because we know deep sleep tends to be on the first half of the night, REM more on the second half of the night, more plentiful, or the ratio goes up. So if you're then on the flip side during the weekday, you're waking up earlier, and maybe sometimes you're like, oh, I gotta get to that like workout class or whatever the heck I'm doing, and so you might be waking up earlier, and then you're lobbing off some of your REM opportunity. So these things have real measurable impacts when we start moving around those sleep wake times. So that's one of our kind of biggest levers that we can bring in is that consistency. And people will be often surprised and delighted over time, not initially. You may test this and you may not like me for a little bit of time. And because we were using this as a coping mechanism to maybe make up on some of that lost sleep, or to deal with some of the different changes that we might have as just like habits, automatic habits. Oh, well, it's Friday, so I always go to bed a decent amount later or whatever. But when you start doing this over time, it really, if you stick with this, it'd be a little uncomfortable at first and set yourself up for success. Obviously don't do this during times where you're going to do a drive across country or something. So set yourself up during a time where you can kind of, have this flexibility and workability to kind of get yourself back on track with your sleep. But then once this starts being in place, the magic starts to happen, because now you're starting to strengthen your circadian rhythm. And what's happening there is now you're having a fairly consistent cortisol pulse in the morning, which is what we're all looking to achieve, the kind of your highest shoot of or amount of cortisol in the morning, versus then a nice pulsing of melatonin in the evening, and they're connected. But if we are moving around our sleep wake up time, those hormones, those crucial components to sleep wake, are getting moved around. And that is going to show up in those sleep staging results. But please also know, for people listening, that again, I just see people get so stressed about the sleep stages. We also want to consider that there's often different needs. The body's really, really cool with sleep, and a number of things, but also with sleep, because it tends to go after what it needs intelligently. And so you'll see this exemplified with, say, things like something that's been studied quite a bit is REM rebound. And so if you've been, say, deprived of REM, so we might see this if people are taking certain medications, or THC tends to restrict and kind of limit some of the amount of REM that you might get. When you then remove some of those things, or you sleep longer, so you're able to get more REM and stuff, then you tend to get this REM rebound, and the brain and body goes after that stage that it wasn't getting and it needed more of. So what's really cool is, depending on what you might be doing, you shouldn't necessarily always be getting the exact same amount of like, oh, I need to always have, 2 hours of deep sleep, 2 hours of REM. That doesn't really jive with what we know about physiology and biology. Because if I've got some athletes that are training like crazy. And so then it would make sense that in really hard training days, they might require more of that, say, deep sleep to restore the, kind of human growth hormone and deal with, regeneration and help supporting tissue regrowth and other things that would be supportive during those times. But then if someone just had a death in the family or what have you, and they're grappling with some really challenging psychological things, then we might see certain times where REM, almost our inner therapist, would make sense to uptick during that time. So to think that things should be static like a robot is sort of reductive.
Okay, that's very insightful. Really, really helpful to think about that the body is seeking what it needs. And so
Yeah.
these percentages are going to shift. You use the term, and I use this as well, kind of like making up for lost sleep. But
Yeah.
that implies that there's this amount of sleep we should be having and
So
we're
good.
losing it. So, what is that amount of sleep? I know it's got to be variable by person, but if you're setting this consistent schedule, which I'm going to hope can be at least a little variable because I don't know if I could do 5 on the weekends, but we'll talk about that second
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
if I could adjust that a little bit. But let's start with how much sleep. 6
Yeah.
hours, 7 hours, 8 hours. How do you know what's the right amount for you, for the listeners? Like if they're contemplating changing their habits and their routines around sleep.
Totally. Yeah. Well, one, I'm so glad you mentioned that about what would that even look like to have that consistent wake up time. And so a couple things. One, um, we would want to understand that there's can always be a bit of a swing that we might see, maybe plus or minus around 30 minutes or so. Maybe sometimes you had a really rough night and it was you were out later, or you woke up a bunch or something. And so then we might swing it out a little bit more during some of those nights. So maybe we're more closer to like 45 minutes, maybe max an hour, hopefully something along those lines. But you're still kind of anchored back to that consistent wake up time. And we're designing, if available to us, the wake up time itself. So do we have the flexibility to move our weekday wake up time even just a bit, to be a better catch-all for including the weekends? And this just is innate. So then we get to be some of those people that just like don't even need an alarm, and you're pretty much waking up at around the same time, or you feel really ready when you're waking up across all days of the week. So playing with that, knowing about this, and then instituting when you do have a kind of rougher night, something that's kind of referred to as almost the do nothing method, which sounds really funny. But so when you have one of those rough nights, we might try to often compensate a lot. So the compensating, steps that we might take are very common: sleep in, but then also have more coffee, stimulants, have long naps. Go to bed markedly earlier. I see this one a lot where people are like, oh, I'm dragging. I'm going to go to bed so early tonight. And then we'll see people go to bed like 2-3 hours earlier than their normal bedtime. And all of these things, while it might seem like you're actually really managing your sleep well, instead, it can be a mismanagement of our circadian health and the consistency that the body is looking to kind of achieve. And there's part of the questions on like, why has this gotten so awry? And I would quickly have us know that sleep had really not been studied in any meaningful way until the Industrial Revolution, until we started seeing a real stark rise of insomnia in alignment with the sudden arrival of cheap and plentiful electric lights at night. And so this is a big, big deal, big, big correlate. We started going indoors. I call this the indoor issue, that it's kind of the elephant in the room, that we know in different studies that the average American is spending around 93% of their time indoors. Right. And that was in 2001, before that was this. Yeah, that was before pandemics, before work from home revolutions, before smartphones, before Netflix, all the things. So it's likely it's probably gone up, right? And so at that point, what's happened is that we're no longer connected to these rhythms of nature that used to take care of a lot of this. That's why I always say that sleep is a skill in our modern society. If we were to go in and, time travel back to, thousands of years ago and just trying to make this argument, it would have been a lot harder because we were innately living outdoors and we were tethered to these rhythms of nature much more closely. And we know some of this when we study hunter-gatherer tribes, modern hunter-gatherer tribes, like in the Hudson tribe. We had a sleep anthropologist that took 50 Oura rings to Africa, studied the Hudson tribe and their sleep patterns. Fascinating. One of my favorite podcasts I've ever done. And what was really cool is then they found that their kind of sleep wake schedules were more closely tethered to these rhythms of nature. They weren't always, it's not like they were sleeping some crazy amount. It was actually kind of surprising, I think, for a lot of people. They were closer to around like 7 hours or so. This is not the answer to your question, though, about how long should we be sleeping. But because they've got a whole different lifestyle, they are outdoors under bright light all day. And then at night, there's totally devoid of electric lights at night. So they're getting marked true darkness, something that we're really all deprived of in our modern society. So they are, one thing that is much more aligned is that they're all going to bed at somewhere much closer to shortly thereafter sunset. So often like a couple hours after sunset, sit around the fire, that sort of thing, chat, down regulate, and then go off to sleep. So I share all that because there's been a lot of changes that have allowed for us to start creating these wacky, weird sleep schedules. And I was one of those people of going to bed super, super late, waking up super late. And part of this is because we have the luxury and almost the problem of the comfort of our indoor options of electric lights, 72 degrees statically indoor environment. So it's another circadian cue. So all of these things affect how much sleep do we need, the timing of this sleep, the quality of that sleep. So it does get really, really layered here. But having said that, the most blanket generalized advice as far as how much sleep should a healthy adult get is 7 to 9 hours. That is the call out for a healthy adult. Now, things change when you're younger, things change when you get older. But for a healthy adult, 7 to 9 hours. One thing that we do seem to have quite a decent amount of evidence around is sub 6. So consistently sleeping below 6 hours a night does seem to set us up for quite a uptick in instances of things like stroke, cognitive decline, heart disease, and my favorite, death from any cause, also known as all-cause mortality, simply by that management of maybe insufficient total number of hours of sleep. But sleep is, there's been analogies of it being like a shoe size, that there's many different sizes or needs for each person. So it's really bio-individual. So there will be some of those people that will need more than 9 hours, even though that's that kind of range, or some people that might do fairly well just a little below 7. So it's kind of this U-shape kind of chart, I guess you could say. And then, but when we do see people getting above that 9 hours, often that can raise some red flags just to make sure that there's not undiagnosed sleep disorders or certain things at play that this person is needing to have such a large sleep need. And there are some legitimate things, like we see, there's instances of certain incredible athletes that just, have a lot of demands on their body and then require a sufficient recovery time. So there's certain times where that makes sense. And then other times where this might be compensating for, they're dealing with sleep apnea, they're dealing with restless leg, et cetera, et cetera. So they're trying to make up for that insufficient or poor quality of sleep. So here's what I would say for the average person. If you are tracking or have tracking available to you or interested in getting into this, one great thing is that you can get lots of a breadth of data. And with that, we can start to see what is your total sleep time. And so, what we see, unfortunately, is a lot of times where people are getting 9 hours on the weekends and then 7 hours on the weekdays, maybe. And then it shakes out to like 8 hours average. And then they say, well, 8 hours is my sleep need. Maybe, but not necessarily until we really deal with that timing piece and really clean things up there. It's harder for us to discern what is your sleep need because you got all this movement around and then you're dealing with that jet lag we talked about.
Yeah. Wow. Really, really, really interesting. How about what affects the quality of sleep? You touched on a little bit of things like caffeine and dopamine, um,
Totally.
and the regulation of your circadian rhythm. So, what's your caffeine cycle? Do you take caffeine? Do you cut it off at a certain time?
Yes, I do. So, one, I think the good news is you can sleep well and still have some caffeine in your life. So, I usually have about a cup a day, a cup of coffee in the morning. And so, you can have coffee and still sleep well, but we then do see, like all drugs, sometimes the dosing and the timing starting to tip the scales and be problematic. So, obviously, if we start well, hopefully, obviously, if we start having a lot of caffeine and late into the day, then that can unequivocally, for sure, show up even for the people that say, no, that's not for me. I can have a pot of coffee late at night and be fine. And that can be a big red flag for us that something might be going on with this person's sleep. By the way, another red flag is often something I hear all the time, which is, oh, sleep, that's not for me. I'm a great sleeper. I fall asleep anywhere the minute my head hits the pillow. Those people we especially have a red flag for because you really should not be doing that. It should take some time to fall asleep. And it's a kind of a Goldilocks. So, and it will depend on each person, but somewhere around 15 minutes or so of sleep latency, the time that takes to fall asleep, plus or minus a little bit of time. But if you're falling asleep the minute your head hits the pillow, that's a big sign to me that you're either sleep deprived or that you might have some undiagnosed sleep disorders at play. Something's up. So knowing that there's a lot of kind of fine tuning of this, but for your question of what are some of the things that affect our sleep quality? And then just tag on to the caffeine piece. Another thing that people, if they want to play with some newfangled things outside of caffeine, pyroxanthine is something that could be interesting to explore. That's something that just came out in well, the ability to take it came out in recent years. Really, you can get it both in a coffee form and you can get it in pill form. But the thinking is that it has some of the natures of caffeine, sort of that focus, that kind of alertness, but without the jittery effects and the impacts on adenosine in the same way. So it doesn't seem to affect sleep in quite the same way. Still need a lot more research. It's fairly new to be taking it this way, but pretty interesting and promising some of the things we're seeing so far. So aside from that, what are some of the things to affect sleep quality? Well, one, at Sleep is a Skill, we really conduct ourselves under an umbrella of circadian rhythm entrainment, which is really about synchronizing with the rhythms of nature as much as possible, even despite the fact that so many of us are spending so much of our time indoors. So we're already divorced from these rhythms. But how can we synchronize as much as possible and then see the effects on our sleep? And this is all under as well. The kind of category or domain of chronobiology, and chrono breaks down to like timing and biology. Of course, we know the meaning for biology. So the timing, how time affects our biology is really this whole area of study. And it's fascinating, I think, because the timing is so impactful. And yet as a society, we're really kind of every single day committing a bunch of chronobiology esque sins, if you will, and we don't even know. And so what does that look like? Well, one, we know that light dark, I've alluded to that. So the kind of dosing and timing of phototherapy, helotherapy, the light dark therapies are so impactful and create a drug-like effect, a measurable effect that you could study. So we want to make sure we're really tapping into, are we getting enough bright light by day, darkness by night? This is not just a nice to have, but we know out of different research, we had Dr. Sachin Panda on the podcast, who's on the Huberman Lab podcast, and just a fantastic researcher. So we're really grateful for that. And some of the research from his lab is finding that bare minimum, it looks like the average person needs at least about 30 minutes to an hour each day of bright light exposure outside, not from behind these windows or what have you, but outside to create sufficient melatonin in the night. So
Mm.
what does that mean? Well, it means that most of us are probably not getting that. Or we might think that windows are not obstructing us in the same way. Now, windows are definitely going to be better than being in a dark room for sure. But you can have a huge shift in the impact, the amount of lux that you're exposed to and the wavelengths of light that you're exposed to by simply just like locking yourself outside or opening those windows, or if you're in a car, rolling down those windows so that you get unadulterated, unobstructed light. Remove your sunglasses, remove all the things that could be obstructing the ability to get that light into your eyes and on your skin. And that's going to help support us not only with resetting our master clock, but also with that melatonin production at night. On the flip side, there was a scientific consensus that came out last year that found that the average, or reported that the average person was in an environment, a light environment that by day was on average about 100 times too dim, as compared to how it would be if we were outside like our ancestors. And then in the night, on average, about 100 times too bright as compared to even the brightest moonlit of evenings that we might have been exposed to in nature. So what does that mean? That means that just about every single person that lives indoors and is under electric light at night, you are dealing with circadian disruption, period. Like that is just what you're dealing with. So how do we interrupt that? Well, then we gotta, one, get ourselves outside. Two, we need to be informed of where you live on the planet, having an impact. So the latitude that you're at will impact the strength of that sun, what season you're in. So, I grew up in Maine and lived in New York. In those northern latitude locations, throughout a lot of the winter months, you are getting just a much weaker sun exposure opportunity because it's stretching across the horizon so much. And you're also going to be struggling to make sufficient vitamin D, which is crucial to this conversation of creating sufficient melatonin at night. It's kind of vitamin D to serotonin to melatonin. So in the evenings, then what do we need to do? If we're exposed to all that bright light at night, we must start shifting out our typical light bulbs for more fiery hues, which is what we develop and kind of evolved under, which would be our first real biohack, which was fire. So orange and red infrared lights, those are all options for us that are not going to impact our melatonin as much as these bright blue lights are doing. And it's not just the screen. So it is this, the screens are, we want to look at that, but it's also all of the lights in your environment, all of these, just basic 60-watt light bulbs or what have you, and the lights coming from your TVs and all these things. These are going to impact your ability to create melatonin. There was one study that found even 30 minutes in ordinary room lighting depleted or impeded the ability to produce melatonin by almost nearly 90%. So that's just, hanging out in how many of us are hanging out in ordinary room lighting at night? These are some of the impacts that our modern society and things that we don't quite realize, the blind spots that are impacting our sleep results measurably. That's just the light dark. Then just be aware that then temperature timing, meal timing, exercise timing, thought timing, really interesting one, as well as drug timing. This is known as chronopharmacology. So the timing of your drugs, and you pointed to caffeine, and it extends to things like alcohol, THC commonly, our drugs that we might, prescription drugs, and obviously never stop taking prescription drugs with, out working with your doctor, and supplements and other things that could be impacting your circadian health. So there's a lot there. And I don't mean to say all that to overwhelm people, but instead to hopefully open up the doors or possibilities to the fact that there are some very clear things that we can start to evaluate and have a process to go through and kind of audit. What are some of the things you're doing? How's your environment looking? What are our behaviors kind of amping or shaking out to look like? And then we can start to really get in the driver's seat of our sleep results and measure these with our current tech as well.
How does it affect longevity? How does sleep affect longevity and performance? I think that's a good place for us to kind of end the conversation. Yeah. There's so much more I could keep talking, but I know we'll have to just talk again. But how does it affect longevity and performance? Does it? And can you reverse it? Let's say you're the average person who maybe didn't attend to these issues well through your 20s and 30s and maybe your 40s, and then you said, oh, I should do something differently?
Yes. Oh gosh, so good. So a couple things. Well, one, we know that there's no better time than the present to address these things. Because I mean, that's like the age old thing, of course, so for behavioral change. But really, we certainly know that there's a couple ways to look at this. So if we're talking about HRV, for example, heart rate variability, our ability to, which is a metric of recovery, how well recovered are you, like your ability to recover from stressors second to second to second. We know that if we're tracking that while we sleep, as we age, often that number tends to go down for the average individual. And so, meaning that your resiliency tends to go down. It's, you could argue, make an argument for one of the benefits for having kids younger, it's so that you're able to bounce back a bit more from that sleep deprivation, from some of the things that might be hitting on you from your health and well-being and drinking and other things that we might do, maybe possibly more when we're younger. And then we're able to seemingly recover often a bit better when we're younger. So as we age, you might be feeling that poor night of sleep a bit more, or that drink of wine or whatever. And so maybe even just the hit on you might spur the behavioral change or the interest or need more in wanting to prioritize and protect this area of your sleep. But so having said that, I would say because things are dynamic and as we age, we have often a bit less of that resiliency. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't impact that. That's one of the exciting things about the longevity space, biohacking space, all these things of how we might be able to impact and stave off a bit of those normal things that we tend to see in normal society. And could we, interrupt that a bit? So, what I would say with all that is that one, there's certainly some things that we can do to help get ourselves back on track if, say, we've been mismanaging our sleep for a long stretch of time. There are certainly still some questions, though, about the long-term effects. If you've been having insufficient sleep, crazy timing, maybe almost akin to shift workers, or just how on your plate, or you weren't prioritizing sleep, or what have you. There are still a lot of questions of how much can be reversed when we talk about things like that glymphatic drainage with a G. We mentioned that can be something you can do, decades in advance to help potentially support yourself from difficulties down the road. The DoD refers to, just to try to get this message out of the importance of prioritizing sleep for, Department of Defense. Previously, there was certainly a group that would be like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, mind over matter for so long, is kind of some of the narratives in those kind of echo chambers. And so they've come up with different terms like the point of no return for things like, for men, for testosterone. If you keep mismanaging your sleep, then it appears that there's a certain point where you just cannot get yourself back to those possible levels that might have been available to you if you keep kind of getting that insufficient sleep quality or timing, or not prioritizing this area. So those are some of the terms that they've come up with just to try to instill the importance of this. But I would say a couple things. I would say there's still a lot of questions on how much can be reversed, but we know that from a self-efficacy perspective, there's no better time than right now to start prioritizing this area. An old term, or the one term that's still sometimes used, is sleep debt. But it can be a little misleading because the thinking is pretty clear that it doesn't seem to work out so well to just think that you can repay the sleep debt. There's a little bit that we can do, but for the most part, it just is largely more about coming up with better habits now, in spite of however things were managed before. So that's really important. And for longevity, oh my gosh. I mean, if we know that that sleep, it finds itself rippling into just about every aspect of life, but certainly from a health perspective, unequivocally, cognition and cardiovascular health are two, big C's that show up for sleep and its impacts really measurably right away. But then, not to mention our metabolic health. So many people are starting to have our glucose monitors, to see like, oh, what's our glucose looking like throughout the whole course of the night and day. And we are very clear that even just a night or a few nights of acute sleep deprivation can show up in those glucose results, that metabolic health. So our waistline then gets impacted. And then it goes into other things like our pain perception. People, oh, my back hurts, my this hurts, the ability to kind of withstand some of these things. And if you're not getting enough sleep, then you might have that perception, that amplified nature, that things are feeling worse than maybe they would feel if you were getting sufficient sleep. Wound healing. We know that NASA's done some studies and they really prioritize astronauts' circadian cycle and strength of their circadian rhythm to support that they're giving them the best shot when they're shuttling through space. Sun is rising and setting on average about every 90 minutes when they're shuttling through space. So that can be very confusing for their circadian rhythm. So they take this really, really seriously. And part of that, understanding that if you get sufficient and quality sleep, that can help support you with things like that wound healing, but also if we start looking at other aspects of health, so cellular regeneration, immune function, cancer rates, the list is endless. So at its core, to kind of put a bow on things, what I would say is that I believe if sleep were to become available as like a pill right now, I think it would just be so just the biggest talk, and also highly regulated. Suddenly, so much buzz around this thing that could do pretty much, there's like almost act as a panacea. It would be a lot of like, it's too good to be true. It's this or that. And I'm not meaning to be evangelical about, I am a little evangelical about sleep, but I think that what is available to all of us is sort of this unfair advantage if you really tap into this. Why? Because most of us are sleeping really, really poorly. Just in 2023, Google search trends reached an all-time high for searches like insomnia, sleep help, sleep support. People that are struggling are peaking now at this point. And so we got a problem, and you got a lot of people don't know what they could be doing to make a difference with it. So it's a time to take on it like a skill set and start at Sleep 101.
Amazing. Mollie, last question then. How do you want to be remembered by others? This is the Legacy Podcast. I always like asking people, what do they want their legacy to be? When people think of Mollie Eastman, what do you want people to think about?
I love that. Well, my mission on the planet is to help give people agency with their sleep and well-being. And because I believe that the sleep extends to your well-being, I believe that sleep is a barometer of the workability of your life. And I think, for entrepreneurs and people taking on big things, from, that I'm assuming are listening on this podcast and really want to make that legacy, make that mark. I believe that when your sleep is not working, something about your life is not working. And, I shared, I was an example of that for sure. But what the gift that's available is when we start taking on this area of life and repeatedly, because it's not just like, oh, you get the muscle and then you're done. It's just like a gym. Like you got to keep working at it. I mean, I shared that I'm going to be traveling for a month. And so I'm going to need to really be tuning in and protecting and supporting my sleep when I'm taking on, and as my business grows and all these things, all of us have this opportunity to keep improving and seeing what we can do to make a difference with these areas. So I believe that by changing the game and prioritizing this so primal, like, one of the first developments on the planet when we were all evolving, bacteria and what have you, I'm really going back, but the need to rejuvenate, need to regenerate was always there. And yet I think we've kind of stepped over it in recent years, and we can bring it back as this like unfair advantage because sadly a lot of our society is not sleeping well. So if you walk into an interaction, you're taking on a big venture or what have you, if you are well slept, you are part of the minority at this point.
Awesome. Well, then I guess we're all going to learn a little bit here and hopefully give ourselves an unfair advantage over others, which is worth
Yes.
it.
And spread the wealth too, so then we learn it ourselves, and how can we share about this to others, and hopefully have a new like verbiage or language throughout ourselves, our teams, etc., where we are prioritizing this.
Molly, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot, and now I have a lot of work to do as well. I thought I was a very good sleeper. I'd say now I have a path to becoming a better sleeper.
Oh, well, I love that. Progress, not perfection. Totally. And hopefully, because it's this fine line of, we don't want to be like overly critical or what have you. It's just like, how can we become a bit more resilient, and using sleep as a lens for that? And it's like a daily game that we get to play. Like, my poker players love this because they're so numbers driven and metrics driven. So they just get it. Like, they remove some of the morality and ethics around it. It's just like, oh, okay, so here are my numbers. What do I need to do? And then they move the needle. So I think we could all kind of learn from that a little bit.
Judgment-free zone. Just get better.
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Molly, thank you so much. Have an amazing trip. Sounds like it's a long one. I hope you sleep well on your travels.
Yes,
Despite the change in scenery and time zone, and you'll share lessons later with jet lag. So people can tune into your podcast. They can check out your website, Sleep is a Skill, and learn more. And it sounds like you're going to share over the next month how to deal with some of those things. So I'm excited to learn as well and follow along. Molly, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate the time, and thanks for creating a platform to share these kind of conversations. It really makes a difference.
Thank you.